It's Tak here with another delicious dive into games of yesteryear. I love games, you love games, so let's get stuck in. Today we look at what it was about Metroid and the Castlevania series that made them such genre-defining titles. Drop us a comment and let me know if you beat these games. How old were you when you first picked them up? Be sure to stick around at the end as we reveal one of the biggest twists in gaming history. Unlike the Souls-like or roguelike genres, which reference just one game, Metroidvania refers to both Metroid and Castlevania. This is because the games were similar in many ways, but both broke new ground in different ways that would help influence future Metroidvania titles. Metroid was released in 1986 on the Famicom system and 1987 in North America on the NES system. It focused on exploration as a key element of the game as you traversed the labyrinthine planet of Zebes, which connected areas with doors and elevators. Due to its varied endings, it was a popular title among early speedrunners. Players must defeat two bosses, Kraid and Ridley, in order to progress to the final area where they can face Mother Brain. In order to reach these bosses, it was necessary to find power-ups which allowed Samus to reach areas unaccessible at the start of the game. More importantly, these power-ups were not temporary, but stayed with the player when collected. This was actually quite unique as most power-ups at the time were temporary, like Starman in Mario, and this would also set the scene for a lot of Metroidvania titles in the future. Music of Metroidvania was intentionally kept simple, as composer Tanaka wanted to make players feel like they were walking around a living organism. He'd intentionally wanted to avoid including hummable pop songs typical of other games at the same time. I'm looking at you, Mario. The design team were heavily influenced by Ridley Scott's Alien, which was released in 1979. They were particular fans of the creature designs by H.R. Geiger, and these influences can be seen all over the place in Metroid. So while in space no one can hear you scream, they can really admire the architecture. The original Castlevania was released in 1986, but it was actually Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, first released in 1987, that would help to further define the Metroidvania genre. Unlike its predecessor, Castlevania 2 abandoned the linear, timed stages and allowed for open exploration, including some role-playing elements. For example, it was one of the first titles to include a day and night cycle. During the day, Simon could talk to townsfolk and barter with shopkeepers, and the enemies outside would be weaker. During the night, townsfolk were replaced by zombies, and other monsters would be more challenging but offer greater rewards. Not without its frustrations, many players would spend hours lost in the game looking for newly accessible areas, but then in the 80s this was all part of the fun. Simon, taking on the role of creepy grave robber, had to collect the 5 body parts of Dracula that were hidden within 5 mansions in the game. This would give players access to the ruins of Dracula's castle, where they could stitch him back together again just to beat him up again. Won't somebody just let the poor guy sleep? The game allowed you to find and buy a host of useful tools, including secondary weapons that were powered by collectible hearts. Other utilities were also available, like the diamond, which attacked enemies while bouncing off multiple walls. Even some of Dracula's body parts could be used, with Dracula's ribs creating a makeshift shield. Castlevania Symphony of Night wouldn't release until 1997 onto the Saturn, Xbox 360 and PlayStation. There had been several Castlevania games in the preceding decade, but these had largely reverted back to a more linear gameplay style. Symphony of Night, however, hugely expanded on its gameplay and set the standards for modern Metroidvania titles. Playing as Alucard, the son of Dracula with serious daddy issues, you were able to pick up and equip a variety of different weapons, and the game included inventory space, turning an entire generation of children into hoarders and collectors. Defeating enemies granted experience points which could be used to improve one of several players' stats, such as intelligence or hit points. Speaking of stats, how about you help me out and hit that subscriber button, and then I can level up as well. In addition to level ups, players could also find life and heart vessels, which would permanently increase Alucard's stats. He was able to cast 8 different spells, and each of these was selected by inputting different directional combinations on the controller. Experience could be used to improve the effectiveness of spells as well, and even the critical strike chance of some of the spells. Alucard was able to shapeshift into a bat, a wolf, or mist. Yes, this game allowed you to traverse its levels playing as Creepy Fog. He was also able to call on his own cast of Adam's Family-like familiars to assist him in battle, because what is a real adventure if you don't make friends willing to murder for you along the way? All of these tropes that we take for granted in modern games today were revolutionary at their time. Not without their issues, they would influence other game designers to include the best of them and improve on the worst of them. Got to remember, not only were games of the time literally inventing new ways of playing, they were also working within tight technological limitations limitations. For example, Metroid was limited by how big each of its areas could be and how many enemies it could show on screen at any one time. This is why it was forced to separate the game into smaller chunks divided by elevators and doors. Without these first pioneering steps, we might never have had some of the amazing games that we play today, and it's crazy to think of how different things could have turned out. On its release, Castlevania Symphony of Night actually sold pretty poorly. It was only by chance it developed into a cult hit and eventually sold 700,000 copies in the US and Japan. Now, I had promised you a pretty big twist, and by 1980 standards this was huge. I'd mentioned that there were 5 endings for Metroid, depending on how long it took you to complete the game. On initial playthroughs, everyone assumed the player to either be a soldier in a suit or just some unknown android, taking the clues from the combined words Metro and Android for Metroid. In the last 3 endings, the Metroid character removes their suit and reveals themselves to be, wait for it, a woman. She even gives you a little wave. Yeah, I understand that by modern standards this isn't a huge shock, but at the time it was pretty revolutionary to have a female protagonist, especially one in a shooting game. Who knows, without that 12-second cutscene of Samus Aran removing her suit, Metroid might not have paved the way for heroines like it did, and might not have seen people like Lara Croft and Bayonetta. Something else that's pretty damn cool about Metroid is the fact that the monstrous Mother Brain's initial designs was for her to be an old lady in an apartment, because the designers thought it would be funny to have this old grandmother type leading the space pirates. She didn't get her brain in the jar designs until fairly late in the development cycle. So what do you think? Would you have preferred to fight a granny or the monster we have today? I'm always pretty sure I remember my grandmother being far scarier than a brain in a jar. Well, that about wraps it up for this mini dive into what made Metroidvanias, well, Metroidvanias. If you love games and learning about some of the interesting origins of where we ended up today, smash that subscriber button. Until next time, I've been Tack, and you've been just marvellous.